Hi, this is Jonathan Armstrong from Cordery, the compliance specialist law firm. I'm really pleased to say that Tom Fox is with us today for another one of these head-to-head at-home discussions. And Tom, you and I have known each other for a long, long time, and you're, I think, the most prolific person there is for talking about compliance in all sorts of different ways and to all sorts of different audiences via social media, via your podcasts and via your books. And how did you get into that to start off with, Tom?
Jonathan, it started out as social media marketing outreach. When I went into this field in private practice, it was 2010, and there were very few lawyers doing the nuts and bolts of compliance. Many, like yourself, did investigations or would negotiate with the government. But in the United States, there were very few lawyers doing the nuts and bolts. So I was laid up long-term due to an accident, so couldn't go anywhere. So I just started blogging, started doing LinkedIn and Twitter, and really everything came as an outgrowth of that.
And you've now got a huge following for your various channels, and a lot of your work around the pandemic, I think, has been really insightful. And one of the things that you and I talked about before is almost like the opposite of what it sometimes says on a car mirror, where it says, you know, objects look smaller in the mirror than they are in real life. One of the things you've said about the pandemic is often regulators in 6, 7, 8 years' time don't realize the pressures that organizations, that compliance officers are under now. Can you expand on that a bit?
Sure, Jonathan. It's been my observation that if a company sustains a, you name it, FCPA, UK Bribery Act, GDPR, whatever the legal violation is, by the time it's reported or discovered by the regulators, an internal investigation is done. The company sits down with the regulators to try to negotiate a penalty. It could well be 3, 5 years later. And certainly in the FCPA world, 7 years, 5 years is not uncommon for the length of time between the discovery of a violation and the conclusion of an enforcement action. And what that means in reality is regulators look at a compliance program where they are at that point. So if a violation happened in 2013, self-disclosure in 2015, it's now 2020, regulators are going to look at a compliance program through the eyes of compliance programs in 2020 and not 2015 and not 2013. But what that means more importantly for all of our colleagues and peers in 2020 is no one is going to remember in 2, 4, 6 years Q2 2020. They're going to vaguely remember the coronavirus. Yeah, everybody had to wear a mask, or that's when we started working from home. They're not going to recognize what you just articulated, the stresses, the new and different risks, the assessment of those risks, and how you have to assess those risks before you can move to manage those risks, then getting the resources to manage those risks. Obviously, working from home in your world is huge because of data protection. And but what are the FCPA or UK Bribery Act risk implications from working from home? Maybe none, maybe a lot. But you have to assess those risks for your company. The bottom line is, if a violation occurred during Q2 2020, or it's discovered and 2, 4, 6 years from now, the regulators are sitting down to negotiate a penalty, they're not going to remember Q2 2020. They're going to look at 2, 4, 6 years, wherever they might be at that point in time. So it really leads to compliance officers in all disciplines needing to be ever vigilant, ever aware. And the one thing that I can say with certainty is risks have changed. I can't pretend to say what that may mean, but you need to assess the risk for your organization.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I mean, when I was a Boy Scout, which between you and I, Tom, was some time ago, I went and got my fireman's job, fireman's badge, and you had to go and be a fireman, 6 evenings, not a very good fireman. I was 11, 6 evenings over the course of a school term or whatever. And there's, as I recall, 3 phases. There's sort of putting out the fire, which involves hoses. There's sort of damping down the scene of the fire, which is to try and stop those fires starting up again. And then there's the whole learning piece of the fire investigation, working out what went wrong, what our new risks are. It seems to me that in pandemic terms, many organizations are still in the hose pipes fighting the fire. Some have progressed to the damping down operations. I see very few that are looking at what has changed structurally in their business. So they've done the emergency measures to get people working from home, but they've not looked at the new risks. They've not looked at the fact that previously laptops were behind locked doors and now they're in people's conservatories or spaces they share with flatmates, etc., etc. They've looked at the fact that they needed to buy PPE in a bribery context from weird and wonderful places just to carry on the business, but they've not looked at the risks that that might impose with supply chains in countries that they're not familiar with, and oftentimes people who can procure stuff like that in a hurry are connected to politicians or politically exposed persons or whatever those risks might be. Is your perception the same, that people are still relatively early in the curve, or am I just seeing a less organized subset of the greater compliance population?
Well, obviously, it's a company by company analysis, but I think that what you've described, I would say, was end of Q1 and into Q2. I think now, I used to ask the question of where do you think we'll be in Q4? Well, now I ask the question is, do you think we'll still be doing this up until 2022? Because I think we're looking at 18 more months of basically business and life like it is now, even with a vaccine. So how are you going to adapt? But I think compliance practitioners and all business executives have really moved their thinking. We're tied down for at least a year. We may be tied down for 18 months. What lessons have we learned? What can we move forward? What has worked for us? What do we need to modify? And what are our risks going forward? You mentioned supply chain. That's a huge risk. And it's not simply PPE or things that you haven't typically had to buy. The disruption in supply chains has been very, very large, literally across the board. And when you overlay the trade sanctions and trade wars that are going on literally across the globe, I mean, you're sitting there looking at 2.5 months from a potential no-deal Brexit. And for you or I to portend what that might mean it's not something we can do right now. So the changes are moving at a speed of light that we have not seen probably in our lifetime.
Yeah, that's a very good point as well. And you've talked before about organizations doing things more quickly in response to the pandemic as well. For example, organizations that were very reluctant to have online meetings, scheduling 264 Zoom meetings or Microsoft Teams meetings an hour. That pace of change has been phenomenal, hasn't it? That people have changed the way they do business very quickly.
So, and let me see if I can make it as absolutely basic as I can. At my wife's company, they mandated that certain discussions, whether on the phone or in person, had to be behind closed doors, and they had a sort of a protocol for that. Well, she now works from home. She did have a little office in the laundry room, which had a door. Her chair broke. She's now out in the kitchen. There are no doors. Is she violating protocol? I mean, I can hear a conversation going on. I can't tell you what they're saying, but that type of reassessment down to really to that level is something every company has to do, and they have to determine whether or not they can actually make a policy and procedure work under today's environment.
So what sort of practical tips can we give people? I mean, I guess one would be that they have to maybe paper their decisions more so that a regulator looking at it in 7, 8 years' time might at least be able to understand some of the thought processes that they were going through. I guess that's difficult when the pace of change is so quick. But what other things, what other practical tips can people be thinking of to try and protect themselves a bit?
Well, I would have to push back a little on that, because anyone who has heard me speak literally since 2010 has heard me say the following. The three most important things in compliance are document, document, document. Whatever you do, document. It's probably more important now for the reasons you just said. What is a regulator going to review in 2022, 2024, 2026? Because if it's not documented in a regulator's eyes, it never happened. But interestingly, the U.S. Department of Justice released on June 1, the 2020 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. And one of the key emphasis in that document was continuous monitoring, continuous improvement. Don't think of a risk assessment as a major triennial, biennial, or even annual event. Assess your risks as they come up. So that we've been talked about working from home as a risk that's changed. Assess that risk. Assess your PPE purchase in your supply chain risk. Assess your supply chain risk. Assess the risk, or what are the pressures on your sales organization, both internally and externally. The fraud triangle tells us pressure, opportunity, rationalization. Well, certainly there's increased pressure literally across the globe because of the economic downturn. Has that changed your risk? But the important thing is to assess those risks. You don't have to fix them all at once, but what the government, I think, literally every government wants to see is a plan in place and you following that plan. But it starts with assessing your risks and doing so on a much more ongoing basis. The second thing that the US government emphasized was data. But more than just numbers, it's information. What information are you garnering as a compliance officer that you can input into your compliance program? Have you assessed your culture, your corporate culture, your integrity when you can't be with people, when you can't sit down and have a meeting? How are you communicating with them? Are you engaging them in ways that at least keep their attention and keep them thinking about their obligations under the various laws and regulations? So it is a much more robust in terms of monitoring. It starts with a risk assessment, but it's not in with your risk assessment. Numbers from your hotline, information from your hotline, who's looking at your policies and procedures, where in the world are you getting calls from, what searches are people running on your policies. All of that information, all of that data gives you information that you can more aggressively fine-tune your compliance and ethics program going forward.
That's fascinating stuff. And so what is the future of compliance and what is the future of compliance professionals? Obviously, I'm guessing from what you're saying, a closer association with data analysts and researchers. But what does the compliance team of the future look like?
So our colleague Jonathan Marks has said that business intelligence has finally come to compliance. And I think he's spot on with that the compliance officer is not a lawyer writing policies and procedures. He is really a business analyst looking at the topic of compliance. There may be inefficiencies in compliance. There may be inefficiencies in the process he can bring to the attention of the operations folks, but it must be a much more holistic review of your total enterprise risk, and you must monitor that risk, and you must improve that risk, and you must have it documented to show the regulators that you've done that. At least here in the United States, there has never been a prosecution of a compliance officer for making the wrong decision. There have been prosecutions for being a part of the bribery scheme or putting your head in the sand, conscious indifference. But as long as you document your decision, the government has told us, at least since 2012, what they want to see is a well thought out program and your actions based upon a written protocol.
Well, that's really good stuff, I think, to end on. Tom, I think the future is bright, but the future includes documentation and analysis. Thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to hearing more of your thoughts over the coming months. Thanks for joining us, Tom.
Thank you, Jonathan.